everybody. My name is Laura, and yes, I am Dad Aspie. And in today's episode of Busting the Stigma, we are going to talk about a very basic breakdown of the autism spectrum itself. Now, I think a lot of this may have been covered in the previous video because a lot of this is kind of similar, at least what I'm going to be speaking about mostly. But it does sort of involve the difference between how autism is defined in the DSM-4 and the DSM-5. I do know that in the next episode we'll talk a little bit more about what those changes are exactly and why they may or may not have been helpful, but for here, I want to let you know how the spectrum is a spectrum. So kind of similar to things like sexual orientation or gender identity, even sex. Autism is a spectrum, which means that there's no, concrete, what's the word? Concrete labels, I want to say, but there's, the idea is that no two people with an autism spectrum disorder, or who are on the autism spectrum, are alike. I got distracted because I felt something on my fingernail, and I was like, what? And before anyone asks, yes, it is proven that gender identity and sexual orientation, and even sex, like biological sex, can be all on their own spectrum. Even Bill Nye says it. That's actually where I learned that from, and it is scientifically proven to my knowledge, so feel free to do some research on that. It's actually pretty fascinating, and it's really cool to think about. But anyway, I'm sidetracked now. The other thing to keep in mind is that when you're looking at the wide range of the spectrum, people often think of functioning labels. So, for example, you have your high-functioning autism and your low-functioning autism. Not everybody likes using those. There's actually been some people in the autism spectrum community speaking out about that, feeling that, well, just because their functioning levels may be lower doesn't make them any less of a person. My guess on where the labels came from is because they compare, how we function versus what's expected of us in society, and I guess I can see where some of that comes from, where when you go to different places, functioning is it might be a little bit different, but also just because you may be lower functioning doesn't mean you're any less deserving of rights and, I guess, privileges? Basically, you're not less of a human because you are considered to be functioning at a level that is less than what society expects you to. I don't know if I worded that very well. I'm very sorry if I didn't, and yeah, I'm hoping that maybe what I'm talking about will help further explain what the hell this all means. Another way that people may identify it, instead of using functioning labels, may go with, the level of needs that a person needs. And I've been trying to lean a little bit more towards that, too. I will say functioning labels so that neurotypical people or people who are not autistic can understand, because they often use those labels for, someone with high-functioning depression or a high-functioning alcoholic or something. It's mainly so that they would understand what I'm talking about, but I want to try to help maybe shift the language a little bit. So to say, for example, that someone has more needs, more severe needs, that may be what people would know as low functioning. Versus someone who may not have any needs for assistance could be considered high functioning, kind of like myself. If you or someone you know has more needs to function in society, as comfortably as possible or as effectively as possible, you may have just autism. They technically call it autistic disorder in the DSM-4, and they call it autism spectrum disorder in the DSM-5, but it's what people think of as the classic autism. It's more likely that people on that end of the spectrum may be nonverbal. They might have, some fine motor skill issues. Some of them may not know how to tie their shoes. But that doesn't guarantee any of that. It's just more likely that they may not live as independently as someone with fewer needs. But again, every autistic person is different, so you meet one autistic person, you meet one autistic person. People with moderate level of needs may also fall into that category. Everything about this is generally subjective. This is from my understanding mostly, and I did try to research this a little bit, but I'm not getting a ton of information on it, so I'm just going to speak from what I understand. I'll include some of the articles that I did look at, or some of the pages that I found information from, but again, I'm not a professional, so feel free to take this with a grain of salt. Now, when you stick on to the moderate level of needs to the lower level of needs, that's where your like Asperger's and PDD and OS is going to come in. Essentially, at that end of the spectrum, those people are more likely to live independently, be able to live more on their own, but may still require some assistance with other things. And what those things are depends on the person. So, for example, myself, I am on the lower level of needs where I can live mostly independently. As far as I'm aware, I can do that, and I've been doing more or less that for 10 years in New York City. Where my needs are is some in social, and I've been working on that through like theater and art and trying to connect with more people. I think I struggle personally more in the executive function part of living, which is like things like budgeting sometimes I'm not always very good at. I'm still figuring out some of this myself, but that's just one example. What's also interesting is that the DSM-4 did divide autism spectrum disorder in like a few separate categories, and then one of the changes of the DSM-5 is that it lumped it all together under autism spectrum disorder, or they are all considered to be autism spectrum disorders. And these include autistic disorder, Rett's disorder or Rett syndrome, Asperger's syndrome, childhood disintegrative disorder, words, and pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. I've been trying to figure out if Rett's syndrome is technically still part of the autism spectrum. I'm not 100% sure, so I don't want to say either way. And I don't really know much about childhood disintegrative disorder is, and I don't want to speak on that because I don't know much about it, so I'm going to have to look it up myself. But if you look at the breakup of the DSM-4, I would say that autistic disorder and Rett syndrome would be in the more severe category, or like more needs are needed. Asperger's and pervasive developmental disorder would be like in the more mild end of the spectrum, or like the minimal needs. Although, at a point with a moderate, those two can start to intermingle, again, depending on the person. As far as childhood disintegrative disorder goes, I don't know enough about it to be able to place it anywhere, so I guess it's in the middle, unless I find out otherwise. I really have no fucking idea. But the criteria to diagnose any of those are all a little bit different, and that's where some of the spectrum starts to come into play. If I remember correctly, with Asperger's syndrome and PDD and OS, there's not much of a language developmental delay, whereas in autism and Rett syndrome, there is language delay to no language development as far as words, like communication. That doesn't mean they can't communicate, that you just have to find a different way that doesn't use words. And that's where, like, apps and eye trackers could come in, because people with Rett syndrome may not be able to use their hands so well, and other things like that. So that's, again, it's all a spectrum, and it's all, everyone is their unique person with their own individual case. So you really have to look at the individual rather than just the diagnostic criteria. And I think that's the most important thing to understand, is that it's a spectrum. No two people are alike. And before I forget, you might be wondering, what does not otherwise specified even mean? With pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, the thing about that is that a person diagnosed with that does meet some of the diagnostic criteria for an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. However, they may not meet those requirements in the language development, but also the symptoms themselves may not be as effective as it would for, say, Asperger's syndrome or mild autism or the other disorders. It may not affect as heavily. Essentially, it's like a very mild version on that end of the spectrum, but it's still there. And again, it's important to remember that this is all a spectrum, and it's all kind of subjective to the person, so I know I'm probably sounding like a broken record with this, but it is important to remember that. I think that more or less covers it. Let me know if I missed anything, and I may update this if I find more information. It might be fun to revisit some of these if I end up getting like updated information and things like that. And I hope you're enjoying this. This is pretty neat. I think this is a cool thing to do, especially for Autism Acceptance Month, and I hope that this is helpful. So as always, thank you so much for watching, and thank you for all of your support, and Until next time, take care. Bye, everyone.